They thought cutting me out would silence me, but my son carried the words my father could never say aloud. Sometimes silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. Hey guys, tonight on Revenge Stories 94, we witness a betrayal not by strangers, but by those who share your blood, the kind that cuts deeper because you once believed they'd never hold the knife. At her father's will reading, she was told to her face she was dead to the family. But what they didn't expect was that her son, quiet, observant, and unwavering, had been carrying the truth the whole time. This is not just a story of inheritance, it's a story of quiet dignity, generational pain, and the moment truth walks back through the door. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and local time. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour a glass of wine, and let's step into tonight's story together. The moment I stepped into that room, I knew the chair wasn't meant for me. It sat at the farthest end of the long oak table, a little uneven, the only one without a glass of water beside it. No one looked up when I walked in. No one shifted to make room. Not Amanda, not Uncle Dennis, not the cousins who once played hide and seek in our backyard. I felt Lucas's small hand tighten around mine, and I squeezed back, grounding myself. His fingers were warm, mine were trembling. They didn't wait for the lawyer to begin. Amanda stood the moment I entered, perfectly pressed in her gray pantsuit, and said loud enough for the mahogany walls to echo it back, "If she gets a penny, I'll sue." No greeting, no eye contact, just a sentence sharp enough to split bone. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The others picked up where she left off. Side glances, small smirks, the same low hum of contempt I remembered from years ago. Uncle Dennis chuckled, the sound dry and smug. "Your mother's dead to this family," he muttered to Lucas like the boy didn't have ears. She left. She doesn't get to come back now that there's something on the table. Lucas didn't speak. He just looked down at his sneakers. My heart broke all over again. That room wasn't built for reconciliation. It was a courtroom disguised as a dining space. The table was polished, the chairs stiff, and the air smelled of stale cologne, bitter coffee, and old betrayal. Amanda took the head seat naturally. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun lipstick, a deep red that looked more like warning tape than makeup. She crossed her legs, folded her hands, and smiled at me like she'd already won. "Dad said you were dead to him." She added, her voice syrupy and cool. "You know that, right? He rewrote everything. You're not even a footnote." I nodded. I wanted to laugh at the predictability of it all. Amanda had always loved being the executioner of our family's judgments. She used words the way some people use knives, carefully and only to cut. I looked at Lucas and forced a smile. Then, wobbly, he didn't smile back. He was studying the room like he was trying to memorize the way cruelty looked on the faces of people who shared his blood. I pulled out the chair at the end of the table. It creaked under me. I kept my back straight, but inside I was folding. I told myself I came for closure. I told myself I didn't care. But that wasn't true, man. Some part of me, small and pathetic, still believed maybe, just maybe, my father left me something, a note, a memory, something that said I mattered. Instead, I found myself right back where I started. Invisible, unwelcome, convenient to blame and easier to forget. I should have known better. 8 years had passed since I left. 8 years since I packed up Lucas, 2 years old, and already too quiet, and drove away from the house I once called home. I didn't run because I was reckless. I left because I had no other choice, because the bruises on my arms weren't fading, because my father told me to stop making things difficult when I asked for help. When I showed up with a suitcase and a baby, he closed the door. No words, no warmth, just wood and rejection. Amanda was there too. She didn't say anything, just stood behind him with that same painted-on expression. Back then, I thought she might come after me. But she never did. None of them did. I built a life for Lucas and me. Quiet, small, enough. But still, when the envelope arrived, no return address, just the date and time scrawled in my father's lawyer's hand, I hesitated. I held it in my palm like it might burn. I wouldn't have gone. Not really. But Lucas, with his steady voice and far too wise eyes, said, "We should go, Mom. Maybe there's something you need to hear." So I put on the black dress I hadn't touched since my mother's funeral. Lucas chose his own shirt. I braided his hair that morning with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He told me I looked beautiful. I smiled, but only because it was the one thing I could still do without breaking. Now here we were, sitting at the edge of a room that had already made its verdict, waiting for the performance to begin. But what they didn't know, not Amanda, not Uncle Dennis, not even me, was that Lucas had brought something with him. And by the time he pulled it from his backpack, this room, this scene, this entire cold little inheritance parade would never look the same again. Amanda leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed like a judge after a ruling. The room hadn't settled, but in her mind it was already done. She looked at me again, head tilted slightly, like I was some sad, distant cousin who had wandered into the wrong room. "You know this is just theater, right?" she said. "Dad made it clear. You're out. It's not personal. It's legal." I stayed quiet. My throat had already closed around any words I might have formed. I had rehearsed so many things to say in my head. How I had every right to be there, how I had survived what they were too blind or too comfortable to see. But now, seated in that suffocating room, those words dissolved. All I could do was sit, endure. Uncle Dennis took a sip from his thermos, the kind he always carried with that god-awful cinnamon coffee inside. He was a man of habits like my father, like Amanda. Rigid, predictable, dangerous when crossed. "Let her sit," he said, not even looking at me. "Let her hear it with her own ears. That's better than throwing her out." The cousins snickered. Not loudly, just enough to remind me they'd all picked their side years ago. I wasn't just estranged. I was erased. I turned to Lucas. He didn't look shaken, just quiet, observant. His eyes moved from face to face carefully, like he was reading them not as family, but as characters. He wasn't afraid. That unnerved me a little. He had always been gentle, but never passive. There was something in his stillness I couldn't quite name yet. Amanda leaned toward him across the table. "You know, Lucas," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you should probably hear the truth, too. Your mom left. Not just this family. She ran out on everything." Lucas blinked but didn't answer. He just looked at her the way he used to look at the ocean, curious but unimpressed. "She left your grandfather when he was sick. I stayed. I took care of him. I was the one wiping his mouth while she was off playing single mom somewhere. I knew that was her version of the story. She told it so often it had become scripture at every holiday table I was no longer invited to. But the truth I left after the final time my ex-husband shoved me into the wall with Lucas screaming from the hallway. I left after I went to Dad and told him everything, my fears, the bruises, my empty bank account, and he looked at me like I'd spit on the family name. He didn't ask where I'd go. He didn't ask if I had food. He didn't offer one single dollar. He just said, "You made your bed, Julia." Amanda had been standing right behind him that night. She didn't say a word. She never did. But later she told people I stormed out because I was dramatic, because I couldn't handle pressure, because I was always a little unbalanced. I think the part that hurt most wasn't that they didn't help. It was how quickly they rewrote who I was once I left. Julia became the failure, the burden, the one who cracked under life's weight, while Amanda, the shining one, stood tall in her spotless apron and moral superiority. No one ever asked why I didn't come back. They just assumed it was shame. In truth, it was peace. Peace was what Lucas and I found in our tiny rental with secondhand furniture and grocery lists written in pencil on the fridge. Peace was reading together at night, his little head on my shoulder, no screaming in the next room, no slammed doors, just quiet, soft quiet. But peace doesn't write letters. Peace doesn't explain your absence at Christmas. Peace doesn't fight back when someone calls you dead. Now Amanda was smiling again like she'd just performed a well-practiced monologue. I could see the shine of her wedding ring, the one Dad had paid for. Her husband Neil sat beside her, flipping through emails on his phone, uninterested in the mess she was stirring. "Anyway," she said with a shrug, "it's all legal now. You don't even need to stay. Honestly, Julia, it's kind of sad. I could have said something then. Maybe I should have. But I looked at Lucas again, and his calm expression gave me pause. He wasn't shaken. He was waiting. That's when the door opened. Mr. Cole, our father's lawyer, walked in, exactly the same way he had every time I'd seen him press suit. Quiet steps, folders in one hand, no expression to read. He nodded once to the room, then set the folder down in front of him. "Good morning," he said softly. "Thank you for being here." No one responded. They didn't need to. This was formality. Amanda had already mapped the inheritance in her mind. She was probably picturing furniture layouts. I'll begin the reading of Charles Thomas's will, Mr. Cole continued, flipping open the folder with practiced hands. I braced for it. I had no illusions. I expected the final wound. I just didn't expect it to land so cleanly. To my daughter Amanda, Mr. Cole read, I leave the primary residence and all of its contents. Amanda didn't smile, not exactly, but the corners of her mouth lifted. She tilted her head slightly toward Neil, who nodded once. They had already discussed what to do with Dad's study. Paint swatches, window treatments. To my brother Dennis, he continued, I leave the lake property and all shares in the family business. Dennis puffed out his chest like he'd earned something. Amanda clapped him on the shoulder like a partner in victory. The room smelled faintly of triumph. To my nephew Grant, he said, I leave the vintage car collection. Grant, the same cousin who once locked me in a garden shed because I wouldn't share my popsicle, pumped his fist under the table. 35 years old and still the same child. Then Mr. Cole paused. I held my breath. And as previously declared, he said, my daughter Julia will not receive any portion of this estate. There it was, not even a hesitation, not a line, not a clause, just absence, just silence. I heard Amanda whisper to Neil, told you. I heard Dennis click his tongue. Takes a certain kind of person to walk out on her own, father, he muttered. Lucas slipped his hand into mine again. His grip was firm. I hadn't realized I was clenching my fists in my lap. My jaw felt tight, my spine burning, but I didn't cry. I stared at the table, at the swirl in the wood grain, at anything but their faces. Why did I come here? What did I think I would find? Then Lucas let go of my hand and sat up straighter. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't shout. He just said in a voice that cut through every snide whisper in the room, You forgot the video he recorded. For a second, no one moved. I turned to Lucas, slowly unsure if I'd heard him right. His face was calm, composed eyes locked on the lawyer at the far end of the table. I whispered, What video? He didn't look at me. He reached into the backpack we'd brought with us, half filled with granola bars, a sketch pad, and his lucky deck of old trading cards, and pulled out a white envelope. It was slightly crumpled, as if it had been held onto tightly, maybe even hidden for some time. My name was on the front, written in my father's handwriting, but just beneath it in sharp all caps was a second line. For the lawyer. Only if it gets ugly. I stared at it like it was radioactive. Mr. Cole leaned forward slowly, his voice gentle. May I, he asked. Lucas handed it over without hesitation. Amanda scoffed at, What is this, a stunt? Uncle Dennis sat forward, trying to peer at the envelope like he might decipher its contents by sheer force of will. His lips pursed cigar forgotten on the edge of the table. I felt a strange wave rising in my chest. Confusion, hope, and dread, all knotted together. Lucas sat back again, folding his hands in his lap like he'd completed his part and was now just waiting for the next act. Mr. Cole opened the envelope carefully, as if it were something sacred. Inside was a USB drive, small, black, unremarkable, but the air in the room shifted. He also pulled out a folded sheet of paper. His brows furrowed as he read. His face, always so unreadable, cracked slightly. A flicker of recognition. A slow, steady nod. It's time-stamped, he said quietly. It's authenticated. The instructions are very clear. I am required to play it. Amanda stood up halfway in her chair. This is ridiculous. There was no mention of Mr. Cole raised a hand, not unkindly, but with finality. I recognize the signature, the handwriting. I am legally obligated. Uncle Dennis looked like he wanted to object, but said nothing. Grant's leg bounced under the table. Mr. Cole walked to the sleek black laptop set up on the nearby credenza. He inserted the USB drive, clicked through the files without hurry, and turned the screen toward the table. The screen flickered, then went black again. One word appeared, play. I couldn't move. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear. My palms were damp against my dress. My legs felt cemented to the floor. Mr. Cole pressed the space bar. And there he was, my father, Charles Thomas. Older than I remembered, his hair was thinner, his shoulders smaller. He wore the navy sweater I had bought him for his last birthday, the one I didn't know he'd ever worn. He was seated at the desk in his study, the antique globe behind him, just as it had always been. His hands were clasped, His fingers twitched slightly, a nervous habit I'd inherited without realizing. And then he spoke. "Hi, Julia." I couldn't breathe. His voice was softer than I remembered, not stern, not distant, just tired. "If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and I'm guessing things didn't go well at the reading." He looked down briefly, then back at the camera. "I didn't expect peace between you and the family. I know what they think of you. Hell, I know what I said about you." He paused. "I believed Amanda. I believed Dennis. I believed that you left because you didn't care. I didn't ask questions. I didn't listen to you. Not once." My chest ached. I felt Lucas's gaze on me, but I couldn't turn away from the screen. "You came to me once, with Eli, with nothing. And I turned you away. I shut the door in your face. I told myself I was protecting tradition, protecting family. But the truth is, I failed you." He swallowed. "You tried to build something better for your son, and I punished you for it. Because I didn't understand that strength isn't staying, it's leaving when you have to. It's choosing peace over appearances." He looked away again just for a moment. His hands were shaking slightly now. "I met Lucas one day when he stopped by with your neighbor. You were at work. He didn't say much. But when I asked about you, he said—" My father's voice cracked. He said, "My mom is the safest place in the world." I pressed my hand to my mouth, suddenly unable to hold the tears back. I knew then my father whispered that I'd lost something I never deserved to keep. I lost my daughter because I thought being right was more important than being kind, more important than being a father. The room around me was silent. No one spoke and no one dared, and I won't let my final act be pushing you away again. He leaned forward, eyes steady. "So I changed the will." A collective shift. Someone gasped. Amanda flinched. Dennis's chair creaked beneath him. "I've left the house to you and Lucas, the savings, the retirement fund, a college trust for Lucas." He nodded slowly. "I know it doesn't make up for what I broke, but I want you to have peace, the peace I couldn't give you when I was alive." Then he looked directly into the camera. "And if they're angry, let them be angry. You earned this. You lived through all of it, and you never stopped being a mother. That's more than I ever managed." A sob escaped me before I could stop it. My father's voice softened. "I'm proud of you, Julia. I always was. I just didn't know how to show it." Then just before the screen went dark, he added, "Tell Lucas thank you." And it was over. The screen turned black. No music, no fade out, just silence, thick, holy, undeniable. I didn't look at Amanda. I didn't need to touch her. Lucas slid his hand into mine again. I was still crying, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from something that felt dangerously close to relief. My father had seen me after all this time, all the silence, all the exile. He had heard me, and no one, no smug smirk, no cold dismissal, no cruel whisper could ever take that away. No one spoke. Not Amanda, not Uncle Dennis, not Grant. Even Mr. Cole sat motionless, his hand hovering above the laptop as if stopping the video had also stopped time itself. The silence wasn't awkward or waiting. It was stunned, heavy, like someone had dropped the truth in the center of the table and now everyone was too afraid to touch it. I wiped my cheek with the back of my hand. My skin was burning, but I wasn't ashamed. I was alive in a way I hadn't been in years. Amanda sat rigid, her face pale. She clutched the arms of her chair like she needed something to hold on to. That, that wasn't in the will," she said, finally her voice sharp with disbelief. "It was," Mr. Cole replied calmly, his tone stripped of the usual legal distance. "Your father left very clear instructions that if the situation became adversarial, this video would serve as the legally binding amendment. But you read the other version," Dennis said louder, now voice beginning to rise. "You read the one where she was out. You can't just switch." "I can and I must," Mr. Cole said, folding the paper from the envelope and setting it gently beside the laptop. "This was signed and dated after the original will. It overrides all previous declarations. It is valid and binding." Amanda slammed her hand on the table. "This is a setup." He was old, confused, manipulated. Lucas didn't flinch. He looked at her with that same unreadable calm and said quietly, he knew exactly what he was doing. Amanda stared at him. Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked like someone who had always known the stage belonged to her, only to suddenly realize she'd been standing in someone else's story the entire time. "You don't deserve it," she hissed under her breath more to herself than anyone else. You weren't here, but I was the one who stayed, and you made sure everyone saw it," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "You didn't take care of him. You performed it." She turned to me, jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're talking about." "No," I said, "I didn't. For a long time, but now I do." I looked around the room, faces I hadn't seen in nearly a decade. People who once laughed at my wedding, who held Lucas when he was born, who watched me carry groceries alone after my husband left, and never once asked if I needed help. They had made their silence clear, but today the silence was different. Today the silence was listening. Mr. Cole stood slowly, his voice quiet but certain. "There will be paperwork, transferring of assets, nothing you need to worry about now. The instructions are clear and I will carry them out." I nodded. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't even sure I wanted what my father left behind, but I knew I needed to hear him say those words. And now I had. Lucas reached for my hand again and I took it. Amanda stood abruptly. Her chair screeched against the floor, the sound cutting through the stillness like a blade. She gathered her purse with shaken hands, shoved it onto her shoulder, and walked toward the door. She didn't look at me. Her husband followed, red in the face, muttering something I didn't bother to catch. Uncle Dennis stayed seated a moment longer. He looked at Mr. Cole like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to claim something had been stolen. But even he knew it was over. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and left without a word. The others followed. Some cast glances my way, confused, awkward, maybe even a little ashamed. A few nodded, respectful almost. Or maybe they were just unsure how to act around someone they'd already buried in their minds. And then, just like that, it was over. The room emptied. The heat of the accusations faded. What remained was soft, still. Lucas and I were alone with Mr. Cole, who now seemed like a different man, no longer the executor of someone else's words, but a witness to something redemptive. He gently closed the folder, cleared his throat, and said, "Take your time, there's no rush." He offered me a small, genuine smile and walked out, leaving us in the quiet. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Lucas turned to me, his expression calm but warm. "Are you okay?" he asked. I nodded, but the truth was bigger than yes or no. I was something deeper than okay, something fuller. I looked around the room again, same walls, same table, but now everything felt changed. The silence here didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt clean, like something had been rinsed out of the air. For so long I had feared returning to this place. I thought it would destroy what little strength I had left. I thought I would walk in and unravel, but I hadn't unraveled. I had remembered who I was. And someone else, someone whose opinion I'd let define my pain, had remembered too. That mattered. It didn't undo the years. It didn't rewrite the loneliness, but it gave it meaning. Sometimes that's enough. Lucas stood up and started gathering his things, his backpack, the sketch pad, the envelope now emptied. I watched him move so sure of himself, so grounded. I wondered when he had grown into someone who could carry something that heavy without flinching. "You did something brave," I said softly. He shrugged, not out of modesty, but because it didn't feel like bravery to him. "Just rightness. I just wanted you to hear him," he said. And I had, not just in the video, but in every choice that led to it. In every second Lucas had guarded that envelope, in the trust he'd placed in me even when the world tried to convince him otherwise. I reached out and pulled him into a hug. He let me hold him even though he was starting to think he was too old for that. His arms wrapped around my waist, firm and warm. We stayed like that for a long moment, just breathing, the sound of nothing around us, but it was a good nothing, a stillness that didn't hurt, a silence that didn't accuse. I looked at the chair Amanda had left behind, still askew, still warm maybe from all her fury, but unoccupied. Let her keep the rage, let her carry the bitterness. I had something else now, something harder to earn, something she never even knew to want, peace. We didn't leave the room right away. Maybe it was inertia. Maybe I needed to sit with it, this strange sensation of having been seen, finally, not as the villain in someone else's story, but as the person I knew I was. I had spent years walking through life with my shoulders slightly hunched, not from shame, but from memory. Memory of closed doors, of phone calls that went unanswered, of holidays where the silence from the family was louder than any celebration. Now that silence was broken. Lucas sat beside me again, legs swinging slightly off the edge of the chair, as if we were waiting for the next scene to begin. But the performance was over. And yet in this stillness, something real was unfolding. I turned to him. When did he give it to you? I asked. Lucas didn't look away from the tabletop. The day I went to see him. I didn't tell you everything. I didn't want to get your hopes up. I nodded slowly. I remembered that day. I had been stuck in traffic coming back from work. My neighbor Melissa had offered to drop something off at my father's place, and Lucas had begged to come along. It had felt harmless, routine, but when he came back, he was quiet, not sad, just thoughtful. He'd eaten dinner like usual, done his homework, and kissed me goodnight. He had held that secret all this time. He said to keep it safe, Lucas continued, and only give it to the lawyer if it got ugly. I exhaled. It got ugly, I murmured. Lucas nodded once. He looked tired that day, he said, but not mean. He didn't talk a lot, just ask questions about you, about school. He made me a sandwich, even though he forgot to put cheese in it. I didn't tell him. I smiled quietly. Dad had never been much of a cook. When Mom was alive, he never even poured his own coffee. After she passed, I think he just kept pretending someone else was still taking care of him. He asked if I liked living where we do, Lucas added, and I said yes. I told him, we don't have a big yard, but you let me paint my bedroom walls. I said, you always listen, that you don't yell. And then he went quiet. I closed my eyes. I could picture it, my father sitting across from this child who bore his blood but none of his armor, who didn't speak with sharp edges or perform loyalty to prove worth. Just a boy, simple, honest, and somewhere in that simplicity, my father had finally heard what he had refused to hear from me. I think he knew he'd made a mistake, Lucas said. He didn't say it like that, but he looked like someone who knew. I took his hand again. We didn't speak for a moment. That's the thing about children. They don't give long speeches, they don't hold grudges the way adults do, but they carry truths. They see through noise, and they remember kindness even if it only came once. I stood slowly, the weight in my chest a little lighter now. Lucas followed, slipping the empty envelope back into his backpack as if it were just another paper, no longer dangerous, no longer secret. As we walked down the hallway, I passed the portraits on the walls, photos of Dad with Dennis on the boat, Amanda's wedding day, one of the family at the old cabin before everything cracked. I wasn't in most of them. I used to wonder if that was intentional, if my absence from the walls was just another form of erasure. Now I realize something different. Maybe I was never meant to be framed. Maybe I wasn't the kind of daughter who fit into picture-perfect expectations. Maybe I never smiled quite right or sat with my hands folded just so. But that didn't make me less. It made me me. And that, in the end, was what my father had finally seen. Outside, the sky had shifted from a high white glare to the soft gold of late afternoon, the kind of light that makes even old buildings look forgiven. Lucas reached for my hand again as we walked to the car. What happens now? He asked. I didn't have a perfect answer. The house, the accounts. The logistics, those were details Mr. Cole would manage. But the real answer, I think I said, slowly, we get to choose what happens next. Lucas looked up at me, like starting over, maybe not starting over, I said, but starting forward. He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. We drove home with the windows cracked. The breeze tangled his hair, and he let it. He had always liked movement cars, planes, wind, things that didn't stay still. I glanced at him once, just once, and thought about how lucky I was, not to have inherited a house, not even to have received my father's apology, but to have raised this boy, this steady, thoughtful, unshakable boy, who carried something that wasn't his burden and handed it over, not for justice, but for clarity, for peace. I didn't say anything to Lucas on the drive. He didn't need words. But when we pulled into our driveway, when I turned the key and the engine sighed into silence, I reached over and touched his shoulder. Thank you, I said. He looked at me and tilted his head. For what? For believing I deserved to be heard. He blinked once, then nodded. You always did. I didn't cry then. I just breathed. For the first time in a long time, it felt like breathing was enough. Inside, the apartment was exactly as we had left it, coats on the hook, dishes in the sink, the scent of citrus from the candle I forgot to blow out. Nothing monumental, nothing elegant, but it was ours. Lucas kicked off his shoes and disappeared into his room, already talking about what he'd draw next. I stood in the doorway for a long time, hand still on the doorknob, the afternoon light spilling across the floor like a blessing. This wasn't the life anyone in that room thought I deserved, but it was the life I built. And now, with nothing left to prove, it finally felt like home. I stood in the kitchen, still in that black dress, still barefoot on the cold tile floor, watching the sun drag shadows across the counter. The envelope was gone. The video had played. The inheritance, whatever shape it took, was now mine. But that wasn't what had shifted. What stayed with me was that voice. His voice. My father's voice breaking just slightly as he said he was proud of me. As if those words had to fight their way out after years of rust and silence. And for once, they didn't come too late. I reached into the cabinet and pulled down 2 mugs. Mine was chipped at the rim. Lucas had dropped it once while helping with dishes, and I never replaced it. His was the blue one with the constellation pattern, the one he picked out himself on a random Tuesday after school. I brewed tea the way my mother used to, black strong honey instead of sugar. I let it steep too long. I always did. But the smell filled the apartment and softened everything. Lucas wandered in barefoot like me and slid into the chair at the table. He looked at the mug waiting for him, then at me. "You okay?" he asked again. I nodded. "Yeah, actually, better than okay." He took a sip, winced at the heat, then smiled. "You always forget to cool it down. It's a tradition at this point," I said. He leaned back in the chair legs, stretched long, like he was testing how much he'd grown since yesterday. That boyish confidence, that quiet awareness. He hadn't just grown taller, he'd grown into someone I trusted more than almost anyone. "You know," he said, "I was kind of scared they'd throw us out before I could give it to him." "They wanted to," I said. "They just didn't have the nerve." Lucas laughed softly. Aunt Amanda looked like she swallowed a lemon. She looked like someone who finally saw herself in a mirror. I said. That made him grin. There was no joy in watching Amanda unravel. But there was a strange peace in knowing that the story she'd curated for so long, where I was the reckless one, the failure, the disappointment, had finally been challenged. Not by a fight, not by a scream, but by the truth. A truth hidden in a quiet envelope, carried by a child, played back in a trembling voice. I sat across from Lucas, both hands wrapped around my mug. The heat seeped into my palms, grounding me. I was still me, still the mother who sometimes forgot groceries, who worked late, who once cried over a broken faucet because the weight of everything had finally found the weakest point. But now I wasn't invisible. Now I had been named, not for what I had left, but for what I had endured. Lucas looked up from his tea. "Do we have to move into that house?" I smiled. "No, not if we don't want to." "Good, I like it here," he said. "But maybe we can visit, like make it ours slowly." That struck something in me. The idea of making space ours, not just inheriting it, but reclaiming it, rewriting its meaning, turning cold rooms into safe ones, erasing ghosts with laughter and music and quiet, gentle mornings. "We'll do that," I said, "at our pace." Lucas nodded like he'd just made a contract with the universe. Then he stood stretched and disappeared into his room again, humming something tuneless. I stayed at the table a while longer thinking about what I had carried, the shame, the distance, the years of being cast out only to discover I was never the one who needed to apologize. I had done the unthinkable in their eyes. I had chosen safety over loyalty, healing over tradition, and I had paid the price in silence. But silence doesn't always mean defeat. Sometimes silence is waiting. Sometimes silence is protection. Sometimes silence is the last defense against people who will twist your voice until it no longer sounds like yours. And today, silence had spoken. My father's silence finally broken. My son's silence deliberate and timed, and mine, long patient, enduring, had finally been answered. I thought about the other women out there, the ones who left, who stayed, who broke the rules because the rules were never made for them, the ones who sat through family dinners pretending everything was fine, or walked away from everything because pretending wasn't an option, the ones who carried shame that wasn't theirs and hope that never seemed to arrive. I thought about them all, and I wished with everything in me that they could hear what I'd heard. "I'm proud of you. I always was. I just didn't know how to show it. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't a clean slate. But it was something, a thread pulled tight across years of distance, tying me back to a truth I'd always hoped might still live somewhere beneath the rubble." I wasn't dead to him. I had never been. The next morning, I folded laundry in silence. Lucas' t-shirt's my work, blouse is a pair of socks I swore I'd thrown away months ago. The simple rhythm of home, of care. Outside the sky was soft with spring. I opened a window to let the breeze in, and for a moment, I just stood there breathing. I wasn't thinking about Amanda, or Dennis, or the house, or the money, or what came next. I was thinking about my father's voice, and the way Lucas looked at me when he handed over the envelope, and the sound of my own breath steady whole unbroken. We don't always get justice, we don't always get closure, but sometimes we get clarity, and with it a kind of peace no one can take. The week after the will reading passed quietly, like a heavy rain that had finally stopped. No more phone calls from lawyers, no more veiled messages from Amanda, no more sideways glances from people who used to call themselves family. Just a stillness I hadn't known I was waiting for, one that settled into my bones like warmth after a long illness. Lucas went back to school. I returned to work. I kept the same hours. I walked the same aisles at the grocery store. But everything felt different. Not because my circumstances had changed, not yet, but because something inside me had been returned, something I didn't know had been missing until it was back. I was no longer walking through life trying to prove I deserved to be here. And that changed everything. We hadn't yet decided what to do with the house. The keys sat in a small envelope on my dresser, quiet and unassuming. I hadn't touched them since Mistress Cole handed them over, though some days I would look at them like they were a map to a place I used to dream about. Lucas asked once if we could go see it, not move in, just walk through. So we did. It was a Saturday, clear sky, the kind of sun that makes everything look newer than it is. We parked in the old driveway, the one I hadn't seen since the night I left with a suitcase and a baby. I stood on the front steps for a long time before unlocking the door. The hinges creaked the same way. The air inside still smelled faintly like cigar smoke and lemonwood polish. My father's things were still there, his reading glasses folded on the side table, the globe behind the desk, the dent in the armrest where he always rested his elbow. But it didn't feel haunted, it felt paused. Lucas walked in like he belonged, his footsteps light, curious. He touched the wall in the hallway, ran his hand along the frame where his baby picture used to hang. "You think they'll all come back for stuff?" he asked. Maybe, I said, but not for long. We wandered through the rooms in silence. The kitchen with its outdated tile, the dining room where no one ever really laughed, the guest room where I used to sleep after holidays, trying not to cry too loudly. I walked into my father's study last. It was just as I remembered. Papers stacked too neatly, a framed photo of Amanda on his desk, a second photo, one of him and his brother, half faded from the sun, but nothing of me. I didn't feel the sting I expected. It was just a fact. My absence had been recorded, framed, and endorsed for years. But now I had proof that even in that curated silence, he had been listening. Maybe not then, maybe not clearly, but eventually. Lucas picked up a small object from the bookshelf, a silver fountain pen in a velvet box. "Can I keep this?" he asked. "Why that?" "Because it looks important," he said. "It is," I said. "Take it." He slipped it into his pocket, and I watched as he did it, as if he were reclaiming something that had never been offered but always meant to be his. We didn't stay long, an hour maybe, enough to open windows, let in light, make coffee, sit on the porch, and breathe the old air without choking. On the way out, I closed the front door slowly this time, with my own hand. The sound echoed in my chest, but it didn't hollow me out. We drove home in a kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. That night, as Lucas fell asleep reading in bed, I walked the apartment with the lights off, just me and the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the building settling into itself. I paused by the window and looked out at the city streets still alive with the sounds of other lives being lived. Buses signed, a stop's a dog barking in the distance, someone laughing 2 floors down. It reminded me that the world had kept moving even when mine paused. That grief and healing weren't opposites, they just took turns. I stood there a long while, and then I picked up my phone, not to scroll, not to distract, but to write, not to Amanda, not to Dennis, not to any of them, but to someone else, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. My mother's sister, Aunt Cecilia, the only person who had once sent me a letter that read, "You don't need to be perfect to deserve love." Call me if you ever want to sit on a porch in silence and just breathe. I had never called. I typed slowly. Hey, I don't know if this number still works, but I thought of you today, and I'm ready to sit on that porch if the invitation still stands. I hit send before I could second guess. The reply came less than a minute later. Always bring the kid, I'll make tea. I stared at the screen, then smiled. It was the smallest thing, but it was movement, a beginning. I turned off the lights and walked to my bedroom, the city still humming outside. I lay down in bed, pulled the blanket over my shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to brace myself for sleep. There were no words swirling in my head, no inner courtroom, no imaginary arguments, just breath, just stillness, just me. The morning light filtered in through the curtains, soft and golden, the kind of light that doesn't demand anything from you. I lay in bed for a moment before sitting up, not because I had to rush anywhere, but because I could, because I wanted to. The apartment was quiet. Lucas was still asleep. I could hear the low rhythm of his breathing through the wall, steady and peaceful. I walked barefoot to the kitchen and started a pot of coffee. While it brewed, I leaned against the counter and looked out the small window above the sink. The tree outside was beginning to bloom again. Another season had come just like that, and I was still here, whole. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the table where Lucas and I had shared tea just days before. The same chipped mug, the same sunlight stretching across the table like a quiet blessing. I looked around the room, our mismatched chairs, the peeling corner of the wallpaper near the door, the calendar with scribbled appointments and half-erased grocery notes. None of it was remarkable, and yet it was mine, built not from inheritance or bloodline, but from choice, from leaving when I had to, from staying true when it would have been easier to bend, from love, a kind of quiet love that doesn't parade itself, the kind you learn to carry when no one else carries it with you, the kind you pass on to your child not through speeches but through showing up, through brushing their hair when your own hands are shaken, through reading the same story twice because they asked you to, through listening even when your heart is broken. Lucas stirred in the other room. I heard the soft rustle of blankets and the familiar thump of his feet hitting the floor. "Mornin'," he said, sleepily rubbing his eyes as he padded into the kitchen. "Mornin'," I replied. "I made coffee." For me, he teased. Not yet, I smiled. "You got a few years." He poured himself a glass of juice instead and sat across from me, blinking in the morning sun. "Do you think Grandpa really meant it?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment, considering. The weight of that question wasn't small. Not for him. Not for me. I do, I said. He may have taken a long time to say it, but that doesn't make it any less real. Lucas nodded slowly, digesting the words. I think he wanted to fix things, he said. In his own way. Maybe so, I said. Sometimes the apology comes at the end, but it's still worth hearing. He took a sip of juice and looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood. Do you miss him? The question landed softly, but it opened something in me. I miss what we never had, I said, honestly. I miss the version of him that might have held me when I cried, that might have opened the door instead of closing it. I miss what he could have been. Lucas nodded, not needing more explanation. He understood that kind of loss, the kind where the person is gone, but the ache remains not just for their presence, but for the shape of the space they never filled. But I'm grateful I added for what he gave me in the end. Lucas smiled faintly. I think he saw you clearer than anyone else did. I looked at my son, this boy with an old soul and a steady heart, and knew that whatever pain I had carried, it had led me here. To this. To him. After breakfast, we started cleaning the apartment, not because it needed it, but because it felt like a good day for fresh air and open windows. I folded laundry while Lucas swept the balcony. The ordinary rituals of our life no longer weighed down by what others thought we lacked. As I folded the last shirt, I thought about the things we inherit. Some are tangible houses, money, land, but others are quieter, the strength to walk away, the courage to begin again, the wisdom to remain kind, even when the world isn't, and the choice to pass on a different kind of legacy. Lucas came in holding a potted plant, one he'd been trying to keep alive since winter. It was starting to sprout again. Look, he said, it's growing. It is, I said, touching the small green leaf with the tip of my finger. Just needed the right season. That afternoon, I opened the folder Mr. Cole had left behind. I went through each page: deed transfer, trust account setup, letters of instruction. At the bottom of the stack was one more sheet I hadn't seen. A note, handwritten, short: Julia, this isn't enough to make up for what I missed, but maybe it's a place to begin. I hope you walk through that house someday and feel safe. That's what I wanted once I finally understood. Love, Dad. I didn't cry. I simply sat with it. Let the words exist, let them settle where they needed to. There are some apologies that arrive not to fix the past, but to soften its grip. And this one did. That night after Lucas had gone to bed, I lit a candle and sat on the balcony, the city around me humming with life. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who knocked on her father's door with a baby on her hip and nowhere else to go, the one who waited for love in the silence and finally gave up waiting. She deserved more, and somehow, across time and pain and distance, she got it. Not all at once, not in the way she imagined, but enough. Enough to stand taller, enough to stop explaining herself, enough to sleep without rehearsing old arguments in her mind, enough to pass on to her son a story that ends not in bitterness, but in truth. In the silence he left behind, I didn't just rebuild, I rose. There's an old saying: justice is not always loud. Sometimes it speaks in the quiet moments after the room has emptied and only the truth remains. What you just heard isn't just a tale of revenge. It's a lesson in legacy motherhood and the power of holding your ground when no one else believes in you. She didn't need to raise her voice. Yes, she raised a child who knew her worth, and in the end, that was louder than anything her family ever said. If this story touched you, if you've ever been erased, misunderstood, or underestimated, know this: your voice matters. And sometimes the silence you carry becomes the proof that love and truth always outlast cruelty. Please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Stories to 4. Every subscriber brings me closer to reaching 1,000, and that support means everything. It's what allows me to keep creating powerful, meaningful stories just like this, as I said. Thank you for being here. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and remember, quiet strength is still strength.